Welcome to the Roundtable Consult. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Williams, and I'm joined by my co-host, my very ordinary, extraordinary sometimes co-host, Sonia Madison, attorney Sonia Madison. How you doing, Sonia?
It's been an interesting week. We've had, some Supreme Court decisions that have been a little disappointing, slash a little I don't want to use cowardly, but but also we had some storms here, so the weather's been interesting, but it's now back to sunshine,
Oh my
pollen still
God.
everywhere.
It's been crazy with the tornadoes warnings and everything around here too. You would
Uh,
almost think that it's almost apocalyptic, you know. It's
well, the weather
tornadoes and
tells us.
diverse weather patterns. Literally 18 years of us being down here in Nashville, we did not. I think the first year that we were here, there was like one night where there were like seven different tornado warnings areas in one night. And but I don't think we've seen that many of them happen in successive days since we've been down here. So I think the weather patterns are getting worse. What do you think?
Yeah, well, climate change, either you believe it or you don't, right?
It's not real. Come on. Climate change is not real.
Just like the water pressure in our showers. Surely that was a real problem that needed to be addressed, right?
Yeah, you can't have a trickle. You just can't have a trickle. Not when you got a body that big. So, yeah, out of here. Yeah, but it has been crazy with all these patterns. And then you got Malaysia. I think had the was it Malaysia? Who had the no begins with an M. I can't remember what the name of the country was. It just had this 7.7 earthquake, and there were probably like 3,500 people dead, and the U.S. wound up sending three people from USAID. And while they were there, they were told, "Hey, by the way, while you're there, your jobs are going to be terminated. So go finish
I
up
was
what you
gonna
got to
say
do."
there's no money.
It's horrible.
I mean, we laugh,
I
but
think it was
we do
Myanmar.
that to keep
Myanmar.
from crying. We
Yeah, it's unfortunate because you look now you see where the U.S. used to stand up and provide that type of assistance and relief, disaster relief. You got China now stepping in and doing it, which is absolutely crazy. It's like we're ceding our position as the world leader to China.
Which I mean, when he announced that, hey, I'm gonna pause tariffs, so go buy back all this stock. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, well, that not surprising. I'm surprised he said the quiet part out loud because I caught it.
Never
I
be
was like,
surprised that he does
that's the beauty of his genius right there. Is that if I say it out loud in front of everybody, they'll think that I'm just joking. No, I posted something the other day. I said thanks to the cadre of useful idiots we have in this country that he has in his support. He's able to do things like say, "Hey, this is my friend Charles Schwab. He just made $2.5 billion, and he made $900 million off of this market manipulation I just did." And so, yeah, it's kind of crazy where you got people say the quiet part out loud and have no shame in it. But I caught it. I mean, to me, it was obvious. I say what he's really trying to do is you couldn't write a prescription for tanking the economy better than he did. Because everything he did had the potential or the consequence of making the economy suffer. And I thought the purpose was twofold. One was to drop the cost of stocks so that all of his rich people and investors, and he actually tweeted it after I said it. He said, "Investors, it's a good time for investors to go out and buy right now."
right.
Um, so the goal was to be able to buy stock cheaply so that once the market rebounds, you make a lot of money. The second reason I think was to actually force the hand of the feds to reduce the interest rates. And once the interest rates are reduced, and after all the economic hardship had its effect on the people, there's a lot of foreclosures, both residential as well as commercial properties. And with those foreclosures, real estate investors can swoop in, get those properties at a cheap price, and the feds have already dropped the interest rate. Win-win situation for the investors. I just want to be one of them.
I mean, when you heard him say the quiet part out loud, you didn't go and go make some purchases.
Well, it was too late then. I don't have the liquidity yet, but I'm working
Oh,
on it.
okay.
I'm working on it. I'm like, I should have had liquidity. But I'm not big on buying anything in the stock market anyway. I don't really know. I'm not that attentive to actually invest something and to be able to follow it. And if I do invest in something, it's going to be long term. So,
Well, it's interesting because I think it was Peter Navarro. I know him and Elon Musk have been going back and forth, but someone kind of leaked that this was going to happen, that he was going to pause the tariffs, and in that there was some insider trading in violation of the SEC, and we'll see if anything comes of it because again, he's deregulated so many regulatory agencies that it may not matter, but the way that they are clearly manipulating this for the purpose of corporate greed and corporate wealth, that I know that's going to tie into our topic, but it's just again, it's to your point a little bit, we shouldn't be surprised, but the fact that it is really blatantly in our face and we're in an economy in which only certain people can actually play that kind of game. Because as much as it spiked, all it really did was put some people back in the place they were before he took office. But we know it's going to continue to dip because what like the next day, China said, "Hey, I'm still going to increase more tariffs," and they did.
but
As they
it took a
continue
lot
back
of
to the
people who
second.
had it took a lot of people who had liquidity to be able to purchase new stock at the lower price. It put them in a much better position. Yeah, they lost some money for about 4 days or so, but while the market was down, they could buy more stock and instantly watch it just increase like that. It's almost sickening. Well, it is sickening.
I
It's
was gonna
sickening,
say,
mostly sickening
even
because
though I
I
know,
couldn't participate in it.
even though I know you're at the position where you're like, hey, I just like to sit back and watch it happen because we warned people that this was going to be part of the politics for the next 4 years. But it's still, I mean, it's still sickening to see it unfold the way it's unfolding.
But why get upset at it? Why really get upset at it? Jesus already told us that this was going to happen. So we will
So
see
are
it
you
happen.
suggesting that the protest that happened last weekend was not, valid or worth it
No,
or
no, no. I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary. And there are people who are worldly minded who will get out and do this. And they should do that. If you have a civic responsibility or civic obligation, go out and exercise it. Do it. But know that it's not going to change anything spiritually. The course that we're headed on is going to be fulfilled, whether we go out and protest or not. The only way that we can stop it is through prayer, and that's a prayer kind of like Jesus's prayer in the garden. If there's any other way, God, let it happen. Why
I
did I
mean,
feel like?
faith
Why do I
without
feel like
works
I
is
was talking
dead,
like
though. I
Donald
mean, I
Trump?
don't want people to just pray through it. I mean, some action is going to be required along with your prayer. I mean, we've got other elections that are coming up. I think what happened in Wisconsin, in particular, with their Supreme Court, the newly elected Supreme Court justice, was hey, we do not like what has been going on with the Republican Party, particularly with Trump and how the judicial system is not being heard. I think the fact that they elected a Democratic justice was again, an act and along with some prayer. I mean, I don't want to just say just pray, but no, we've still got other elections that need to happen. And it seems as if some of the even Republican parties, I've read that Ted Cruz is stepping away a little bit. I've seen we see obviously Elon Musk and Peter Navarro going back and forth, but I think that's eventually going to tank in terms of which one is the President Trump going to lean more into. So, I mean, I see, to some degree, a path towards change. And I don't want people to just sit back and pray through it because I think we've talked about this before, whether or not God is invested in government is also, debatable. But nonetheless, I mean, there's still things that people can do, whether it's in the voting booth or whether it's protesting, whether even contacting your representatives, making sure it's known that you don't agree with what's going on. I don't want to belittle those efforts.
I don't want to belittle those efforts from a civic standpoint. From a civic standpoint, it matters. In fact, even from a spiritual standpoint, we need to have civic activities and civic unrest in order for the spiritual plan of God to actually manifest. And that's just simply man turning against itself and destroying himself. But I'm saying from an eternal perspective, your protest don't mean a hill of beans. God is not impressed by your protests. He's more impressed by your praise.
What you
And
do for the least, you do for the
exactly.
for
So
me.
this whole thing about faith without works is dead. The question is what type of work? Second Timothy 2 talks about that the winner of a race does not win unless he competes by the rules. Now the question is what are the rules for us as believers? The rules for us as believers is not effect our change through the voting booth. That's not our rule. That's our rules according to our citizenship as the United States in the United States. But in the kingdom of God, that's not the works that we're supposed to be showing. The works that we're supposed to be showing, according to our faith, is enduring persecution, still holding fast to the profession of our faith, still showing compassion to those who despise us, reviling not against those who revile against us. That's how we demonstrate our faith. That same scripture you were talking about, it says, "Show me your faith by your work." I mean, show me your you show me your works without your faith, and I'll show you my faith by my works. The way that I'm talking about demonstrating my faith is by walking in godly principles and not compromising when I'm challenged. And so that's the way we do it. Not the works of
I
the
mean, I
voting
gotta
booth.
agree to disagree because again, slavery would not have ended or been
You
abolished
don't
had
know.
people not had the Underground Railroad, had people not, protested, had people not stood against what was the policy of the government at that time. And so I appreciate that some people said, hey, I don't like that you are dehumanizing, that you are forcing people to do work and brutally hurting them in the process. I appreciate people stood up for them. And again, that's why even what's going on now, when you see immigrants are being snatched up and taken overseas, or even people who are legally here being snatched up and taken overseas, and you just say, oh, well, that's a government issue. That has nothing to do with my spiritual walk. I mean, everyone's going to be different in how they define or how they have their relationship with God. But in my relationship with God, I think when He is making you aware of how His people are hurting, that is His way of saying, particularly if you are in a position to help, He has blessed you to be in that position, you should help.
You should help. And I don't doubt that. Now, this whole claim, I always take issue when people have this claim that slavery would never have ended if we didn't have protests or, I disagree with that. It would not have ended the way that it ended if that had not happened. And frankly, we don't know if that was the way that God intended for it to happen. The point is that when we do things, I don't know that a rebellion against a particular system is the way to accomplish the difference rather than praying and expecting God to change the hearts of the kings. The Bible says that God, the hearts of the king are in the hand of the Lord. And so if we really believe what God said that he would do, we would petition God to make the change his way. And it could be that he kills one king and the next king who assumes the throne has a tender heart toward God's people. We've seen that happen several times throughout the scripture. And so all of a sudden things change at that point. But I don't believe that God is necessarily saying, hey, I love that y'all use this democratic system that y'all created in order to affect the things that my word and my prayer and prayer from my saints couldn't accomplish. I don't think God is impressed by that.
Well, we do have a topic, so I don't want to lean on. I'll leave that to the comments because I also think God uses His people to also effectuate His will.
Hmm.
Um, but I did want to make sure
But
that what.
how?
Oh,
But
you're right.
how?
But
How
right.
does he use us? And
Right, and
so
we'll leave that for the people in the comments to suggest. But I did want to make sure we did have two Supreme Court decisions that came down. One dealing with the old Alien Enemies Act that wasn't used until recently, thank you, Trump, but this was back 18th century law that at that time they were using it relating to Japanese camps. And so it went to the Supreme Court whether or not Trump should be able to still use that to deport Venezuelan nationals. And the Supreme Court, again, I think that they made a little bit of a coward move without by not actually addressing whether this law should be something that is used or not. But what they did was essentially say, hey, yes, he can, but he should be able, or he should go to the courts first to outline what the reasons are and wait for a decision before he zips them off overseas and then being able to argue that jurisdiction is no longer with the United States. Now, again, one of my favorite Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, wrote a very scathing dissent and really talked about how the justices are pretty much essentially, at least when the court went off base in the past, and left a record so posterity could see how it went wrong. And it was citing one of the previous decisions related to, again, Japanese Americans in the World War II. But she's essentially saying with more and more of our most significant rulings taking place in the shadows of our emergency docket, today's court leaves less and less of a trace. But make no mistake, we are just as wrong now as we have been in the past, with similarly devastating consequences. It just seems we are now less willing to face it. And so she's essentially pretty much going about talking about how the majority is not even explaining its decision. They're pretty much giving this blanket, hey, maybe, go back to the courts without walking through whether or not, again, should this statute or this Aliens Act should even be something that we are still using, as well as touching upon, was it wrong for what they did in terms of putting so many people on this plane based on tattoos for the most part, the tattoos they wore, and shipping them to Venezuela. So more, I guess, to see on that, because
I
again,
don't
it's
know
essentially
that
going back to the
necessarily. I don't know necessarily that I agree that this was necessarily cowardly. And again, disclaimer, I am not an attorney. I don't know anything about the law. But my understanding is that certain things have to be litigated at the lower courts before they reach the higher court. And so in order for the Supreme Court to make a ruling on whether or not that Aliens Act should be actually used at all, needs to be at least be litigated in the lower courts first, where they hear all the evidence at that point, because the Supreme Court is not actually hearing evidence when they make the presentation before them. So how is that different?
Again, I mean, that's your opinion, and I'm glad you put that that disclaimer. So how this went to the Supreme Court was because they were using this act to deport so many people in Venezuela, and the judge said, "Hey, let's put an injunction in place, bring them back, so that we can, to your point, talk through, litigate, and discuss whether or not this was a valid reason to go off." The Trump administration pretty much defied that injunction, and it went to the appeals court, and they then went to the Supreme Court. And so, they have the initial process was to discuss and to litigate the merits of this act. And so once it gets to the Supreme Court, then we're doing that again. When you look at history, and one of the biggest things I remember is the Fifth Amendment, the right to remain silent. One of the reasons that, and now you've got me going on a whole history lesson, but one of the reasons why that even came to the Supreme Court was because at that time, courts were not using federal Bill of Rights law when it came to even like the Fifth Amendment, the right to remain silent, because so many criminal actions were being tried by state courts. And so even then, they weren't litigating whether or not the Fifth Amendment federal law should apply. They were saying, hey, under our state law, this is what it is. And that went to and I think it really started in Mississippi. And at that time, what was going on was, I think it was 2 or 3 Black men were arrested for allegedly killing a white farmer. And again, this is coming off the top of my head. So if you're listening, by all means, do some research on this. But
By all
they in the
means.
by all means, but in the course of being interrogated, they were beaten, they were hanged, they were severely abused until they they essentially confessed. And then later, when it went to trial, they sought to have that confessional minute saying, obviously it was coerced. And so again, what the trial court looked at was just state law, did not look at whether or not the federal law applied. And so went to the Supreme Court of Mississippi again, just looking at state law. And by the time it went to the Supreme Court said, no, 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 this is wrong because federal law also applies. And so we've seen in history that the Supreme Court has looked at issues that may not have been litigated in the lower court to ensure that, again, the Constitution is being invoked correctly and to ensure that the law as a whole is being interpreted correctly. And so to suggest that, oh, well, it should be litigated in the lower court, when even historically that doesn't always happen, to me is cowardly, because again, if you know as a Supreme Court that this is not valid law, then we don't need to go through all these steps
Well,
to make a ruling.
The issue with the Aliens Act is that it gave a condition that in times of war that he has that broad authority to do it. And so what needs to now be defined, my understanding, is that this qualification right now, this war against crime or drugs and everything else, technically qualify as a war. And in which case he would be able to employ this particular Aliens Act. But I don't know that they made arguments about whether or not the conditions currently qualify him to be able to use that. The argument that was made, I think, before the court, correct me if I'm wrong, was that due process needs to happen before you can export before you can deport these people and put them into prisons and things of that nature. And if due process hasn't happened, I thought that's what this was an issue of whether or not it was due process, let alone whether or not there was actually a war sufficient to enable the use of that particular act.
Well, there were several arguments that went to the Supreme Court on that decision, and one of them was the validity of the act, because they made the argument that, hey, this act was founded on principles that are allegedly unconstitutional now. Again, it was used related to Japanese Americans in concentration camps and all that. And so those arguments were made, and that's why Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who I mean, to me, you're not going to discuss something unless you have asked the people during oral arguments, hey, what about this? What about that? And that's what the Supreme Court is supposed to do, is to make sure that, hey, because this will be precedent, because this will be used, let's make sure we give sufficient guidance going forward. And so I think that's part of the reasons why she has her dissent, is because, hey, we did talk about this. You're refusing to address it. And instead, you are pretty much going back to a lower court instead of actually talking about whether this should even be applied at all.
You're kicking the can further down the road, because it's going to come back up. And I wonder if that's part of the strategy, is that we got so many things, important issues that are coming up before the Supreme Court now. One good thing about Donald Trump is that he's teaching us all lessons in history.
Right, how to prolong. Because to me, that is their strategy. Is I think the Supreme Court doesn't want to, because it's a conservative court, doesn't want to directly go against what's happening, but instead they are, again, going to continue. Oh, well, let's have the lower court look at that first. Oh, okay, yeah, I hear you. Because we saw that again, even when it came to whether or not he had presidential immunity. We saw that when it came to a lot of these convictions that he had. They just kick it back to say, well, discuss this and discuss this and discuss this, instead of making a ruling on that.
But don't you think that that's a little prudent, because of the sheer volume of very lasting decisions that they have to make right now that are being thrown before them in probably unprecedented numbers, where they're like, we don't necessarily want to rule on this right now and make it a definitive law. I mean, make it a definitive interpretation of the law for the next 50 years or whatever. And it was rushed, and we did not have enough time. It had not been thoroughly litigated in the lower courts and presented before us. And so this is a way for us to say, let's give this thing a little bit more interrogation at the lower courts before we make a rash decision one way or the other.
I think it depends on what is being presented before the court. And when it came to that presidential immunity, no, I do not think that you needed to go back. I mean, to me, that was again you trying to appease Trump and the administration. Now there are situations where I would agree with that, but one of the things that they in which they didn't do it was the Chevron decision, and in that Chevron decision, I know we've talked about this before. So if you're listening, please, I'm not going to go into depth, but please look at some of our previous episodes on it. But in that decision, they were very quick to say, "Oh no, regulatory agencies, what deference do we need to give them? It's all about the court." And instead of going back and saying, hey, why don't we look at if whether or not Congress did address, and if they didn't, let's follow our precedent, because we've already decided that regulation should have some deference by virtue of Chevron, the decision being decided by the Supreme
Well,
Court. They've made a very distinct decision to say, no, they shouldn't have deference, and then let people go vote forward. And so that's why I say they're very particular about which ones they're going to decide on and which ones they're going to kick back.
well, that was an easy one because when
No,
you
that
say,
wasn't.
let me tell you why it was an easy one, because you said we've already had this. No, we didn't. Not that court. It was a different court that made that decision, and it was a more liberal court at that time. It had already been litigated, so they already studied all this stuff long before. They just thought that the previous Supreme Court made the wrong decision. So you don't have to hear, they didn't have to hear additional arguments. They heard all the arguments that they needed to hear in the past in order to make that type of ruling. All they needed was somebody
Presidential
to bring it.
immunity, the same thing. That's also something that had been previously discussed before. They just didn't like the decision. But again, what they did was say, hey, let's kick it back to the court to make a little bit more detailed analysis, which they could have done with Chevron, well, it wasn't, the case isn't called Chevron, but it's referring to the
Right.
old Chevron decision. They've made a definitive decision there. And so I mean, again, it's going to be case by case, but if you want to make an argument that, oh, well, that's prudent for them to do, fine. But it was still cowardly to do it, Another Supreme Court decision came back on Thursday in which they refused to lift a judge's order requiring the Trump administration to facilitate the return of a Maryland man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador. And while they did say, hey, listen, we're going to instruct the Lord judge to clarify the language of their order because they feel like it wasn't, I guess, specific enough. I think some of the language in that decision did make it clear to some degree that, hey, what you guys did was wrong and you need to figure out a way to get them back. Now, I'm going to tell the lower judge, hey, listen, you need to do better about your your orders. But I do think they were sending a message saying, hey, no, Trump administration, you need to figure out a way to bring them back. And so we'll see again, because that to me is still I'm going to kick it back for you guys to litigate this again, instead of directly telling the Trump administration, no, this order is valid. Go figure out a way to get him back over here, because we know, again, he was mistakenly deported. The officials who I believe Trump fired the the guy who
They're on
argued.
administrative leave. Administrative leave is
Right,
what
that's
they
what we're
let go.
calling it. Who admitted to the court that, yeah, they messed up. So,
Well, the issue was more so that he was like, I don't have information. I don't know. I don't know. And they were like, and who was it? The DOJ, what's the lady's name? The head of the DOJ right now.
Bondi, I think.
Bondi, yeah.
Yeah.
Bondi, she's like, well, he's entitled to a vigorous defense. And you're like, what? If you didn't give him any information, is he supposed to fabricate a defense in front of the courts? No, I don't think so. So unfortunately, he becomes the fall guy to say, the only reason we lost this case was because, our attorney didn't provide a vigorous defense for us. And that's malpractice in my opinion. Okay, fine. Uh, how about you give them some basis? Like, my client did not give me any information to that end. I don't have any information. I don't have any defense right now. And
Well,
so
they
yeah,
couldn't deny that a judge in 2019 gave him an order that said he was there legally. He has the legal authorization to be there. And so, I mean, they couldn't deny that. And I think to some degree they did concede that, there was an error that happened, but they
yeah.
were still just making the argument that, but hey, you're out of jurisdiction and it's not anything you can do about it now. And I think that is, obviously we know the Trump administration can work with I'm sure Venezuela would be happy to
Right.
send back
One more space.
people on our right, at our right
Somebody brought up the question
direction.
before whether he might even be alive even still, because he's now
See,
in this. There was a reason why he was granted, asylum here. It was because his life was endangered back in Venezuela. Was it Venezuela? El Salvador,
El
wherever it is. El
Salvador.
Salvador. His life was threatened back in El Salvador. Now they have him back in El Salvador in a prison with the most violent of all gang members and criminals there.
Assuming, because none of them got due process either, but allegedly the most violent.
So if there was an enemy that he had out there, chances are that enemy or some affiliate of that enemy will be in the same prison as he. So I pray and hope that he's okay. One of the things that Trump did say, he said, I worked toward, he did concede to working to try to facilitate him coming back after the Supreme Court said it. Because I trust the Supreme Court. I don't trust the lower courts, is what he
said. Right, right.
Gee.
But I want to get into our topic. But do you think Trump values fame more than money or money more than fame? And the reason why I ask is because, I mean, he's gone through several bankruptcies. We had no issue doing that. But I feel like when he was on The Apprentice, I feel like when he will put aside, from my view, he will put aside whatever it is he truly thinks for the purpose of adoration. And I think that, to me, in my opinion, I think that is even more important to him than money.
It's a good question. I don't know. I think that his fame is a means to the end of money for him. And I think, well, that's true, because if he did have all the money that he had, nobody paid attention to him.
I was gonna say he did. And he was born into money, born into wealth. I mean, he squandered it, but
and the big issue was that he couldn't play with the big boys. They always still poo-pooed him and diminished his involvement with that of the ultra rich.
Nigga, you're giving the alleged big boys a bad rap. I mean, you want to only work with people who are understanding of the issues. That's definitely your preference. We're not poo-pooing on someone who doesn't have an understanding of the issues. We're just saying, hey, you're not the best qualified person in the room.
Oh, no, I'm talking about even before he started running for office or something.
Oh, I know. That's why I brought up the bankruptcies. Because we know as a businessman, he wasn't the greatest.
one of the stories, and I can't remember who wrote the story, they were saying that Donald Trump was shunned a lot by other billionaires, and he never really got to participate in the billionaire club, even though he really wanted to be part of that. Most of them was already saying, yeah, you really don't belong here. And I don't care how much money you have, even when he did have billions, a lot of them would still snub him. So I think a lot of this is retribution. And you're right, a lot of it is attention, because you see him always he does more press conferences and speaks to the press more than anybody, always on Air Force One, giving interviews, and the American people love that. But the reason why he does that is because he loves the attention. He's not doing it because he wants you to be informed. If he wants you to be informed, he wouldn't be feeding you so much misinformation or disinformation. So it's not about your informing. It's about him being able to have the attention and always be in the forefront of people's attention and minds. So yeah, for him, it probably is more about fame. But I do think that, because after a period of time, after you have so much money, what else would you want?
I don't know. Do you tell me? I haven't
gotten there yet. I haven't gotten there yet. I'll let you know. But we always talk about more money is what people are looking for. And what is that? For the love of money. That was
Please
that old song.
Oh,
the shade. I will sing for money. I'll be a private dancer. I dance for money. But he did have a couple of reversals this past week that were basically, I think, motivated by money. And not just motivated by money, but also motivated by, his support, knows that he's going to lose support. So he now said, okay, we're going to let immigrants that we deport who have been here illegally, we're going to let them come back under the right processes so that they can work for farmers and hoteliers. And why you want to restrict it to those two industries, I don't know. But the point is not here to make a concession on that. He also made some other concessions this past week, even on tariffs, to back off of some of those when he saw that the bond market was about to tank as well. So he finally was like, "Oh, well, maybe my advisors were right." And I'm looking at these people who are just like, "Oh yeah, this was all part of his strategy." No, it wasn't. He was going to tank everything as long as the bond market continued to rise because that gave us confidence in the U.S. dollar. But once the bond market starts dropping, you start saying, "Hey, wait a minute, I need to slow this down some." Because I don't want the US dollar to drop. Now it was like 1.04 or something like that, the value of the US dollar. Now it's something like 0.98 or something. And so the value of the US dollar has dropped since he's been in office. And it will continue to do that. Now, I think the course correction for that, that's how he makes course correction, because I think that he recognizes if he can't keep that money, he can't keep the fame. And I don't know that I think he also recognized that if he doesn't have the fame, he can't get the money either. So I
Well,
think it's
it's
sort of
so
circular.
interesting because I think that he changed or paused the tariffs more so because of the backlash than him losing money. And to some degree, I feel like he does not care that it's going to cost so much expense to, I mean, American businesses, American people, these tariffs. I mean, he's known this forever. And even in his State of the Union and subsequent too, he's been saying, hey, yeah, this is going to hurt, but trust me. I mean, his famous line, like, women, y'all trust me, y'all, everyone, just trust me. But the backlash, I think, is what drove. Okay, well, maybe pause. But also to some degree, I am hoping that he sees that this is going to be a struggle that no one wins because again, China is not backing down. And we're seeing over and over again a lot of these corporations pleading him, hey, what let's stop doing this. This is hurting us even more. And so I don't know. I think before he had an end game of, oh, surely they're just going to respect me. I have the fame to to be able to influence. I have the American people supporting me. And now that that is not what it is, I don't know if he has an end game on this at all. But again, I just think he's more driven by money. I mean, by fame than money. And maybe this is a generational thing because I also think a lot of times people are more driven by what they feel like their purpose is or by how many people follow them than they are as much about, I mean, than they are about how much money can I make. I mean, don't get me wrong, I do think money is still something that is in their mind. But I don't know, I just feel like once they lose a lot of their quote unquote followers, it to some degree may belittle or demean the value that they put on themselves.
I don't know. Here's the reason why, because people are destroying their reputations because of their affiliation with Trump. Let's look at Elon Musk. Elon Musk was very unfavored. He used to be a very favorable kind of person. His favorability level dropped before his money did. And he really didn't um, start considering backing off until he started losing contracts and people started re-evaluating the stock of the stock of Tesla and the Starlink contracts that he has. Other countries are starting to consider, hey, I'm no longer gonna renew this contract with him. He's like, hey, I think it was Vietnam that said they were going to consider revoking their Starlink contract. And so he's like, maybe I need to back out for some of this a little bit because all the money, when you start losing that money, you start becoming in jeopardy. Now, understand how they make their money. The way that he made his money was in by borrowing on credit. He doesn't have this actual cash money or anything like that. He was able to borrow against the value of his stock. If you borrow against the value of your stock, and that stock is worth $300 billion or something like that, and then all of a sudden the value of that stock drops down to 150 billion, then the banks say, okay, well, you still got this money, this loan out here for $100 billion, but now you don't. Your loan to equity value has decreased or has changed. And now you are no longer as credit worthy as you were. And the bank can at any moment say, okay, we're going to call this loan. If they call the loan at that point, and I'm not saying that they would do that in his situation. So maybe I should use, the ordinary person. Let's say, for example, you secured a loan using your 401k, and every year you have to recertify that loan. So you now have to provide the bank with evidence that you have the actual equity to back that loan. If you don't have the equity to back that loan, that bank can call that loan. And if you can't get another person or another bank to lend you the money to cover that, then they can repossess those assets that you use to secure that loan. And so that's the risk that people have when their stock values start dropping too low, is that they're at jeopardy of losing everything. So I think there are thresholds. Maybe I should say it that way. There are thresholds to say, okay, at this point, my fame isn't worth it to me because I'm willing to suffer as much as the unpopularity as I want. Look at the DOJ and Hegseth and everything like that. They know that they're going to be unpopular with a lot of people in the United States. But they're willing to do it for fame, for fortune, and whatever else it can offer for them. But at some point, that price does become a little bit too much, and he's like,
Well,
I
I
need to
think
back
Elon
off.
is a good example because I mean, I read somewhere, and I say this because it may not be true, but I read somewhere one of the reasons why he got involved in politics is because he was omitted from a meeting relating to electronic vehicles. And the reason why, allegedly, the reason why he was admitted is because he doesn't have union workers. And so I think everyone in the meeting had union staff. And we know, and this was under the Biden administration. And so we know Joe Biden was very big on union work. But he took that to mean, hey, my fame, how dare they not put me, give me a seat at the table? And then that motivated him to get more involved in politics. And he was probably more Democratic, similar to Donald Trump, probably leaned more towards a Democratic, considering that he was getting a lot of contracts for these electric vehicles. And we know that the Democratic Party has been more, I guess, pushing electric vehicles more so than the Republican Party. And again, same with Donald Trump. He used to be hardcore Democrat, but he probably figured, hey, like you said, they're not respecting me enough, or I would never be able to get elected president under the Democratic ticket. So let me switch over to the Republican ticket. And so I would say that fame more motivated Elon Musk to get into politics, not money. And even as his reputation to some degree was declining, I still would say one of the reasons why he backed off was because he was seeing people torch their Teslas. He was hearing people, talk about how he is responsible for the own destruction of his company. And so, I think to some, and maybe to your point, maybe there's that threshold, oh, I've gotten so much money that it really doesn't matter. I just want to be able to influence. But I just think a lot of people, when they think about their purpose, they look to how can I be influential more so than they look to, oh, what amount of money can I make?
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. There's a quote that I had in my first book, When a Man Worships. It was something to the extent that when you have all of your needs met, the ability to attain all that you want becomes a snare, because eventually, once you've been able to obtain anything that you want, um, your desires and your passions become a little bit more exotic. Imagine you Jeff Bezos or somebody like Elon Musk. You can get anything pretty much that you want, because almost everything in this world has a price, and we like to say that it doesn't, but the reality is
Even Donald Trump has a
that
price.
everybody has a price. Donald Trump's price was, or the presidency's price was, $250 million. Pretty cheap, pretty small price to pay, actually.
Again, your
just
wallet,
wish
not
I
mine.
just wish I had it to pay it. But think about it. You start thinking about, and this is why people talk about the deep state and the pedophilia rings and other things of that nature. I do think that people's desires and passions become a bit more exotic, is the word that I used for it before. So when you know that you got all this money, you can probably, if you're a guy, you can have just about any woman that you want. So you think, and a lot of that probably pans out. You can. So then you say, okay, well, I've done all of that. I've gone after every woman that I want. What else can I get? And then you start saying, okay, well, I can get a man. So then, not that you even want a man, but your passions, your desires, you're like, man, I need to want something else. We always want more than what we currently have, and I think that's something that's innate about man. Even back into the Garden of Eden, and I'm not talking about man being the gender man. I'm talking about mankind. When you've had everything that was made available to you in the garden, it was still a quest and a desire to have what you have not had. And many of us will never be tempted by that because we've never had everything that we need, let alone everything that we want. Once you've already had everything that you want, what's next for you? Once you know you can get everything that you want, what's next? You have to you have to find more difficult to achieve or obtain things that you want. And I think that's why people probably do get caught up in some of these pedophilia rings. They get sick because they start desiring, well, let's see if I can get this. I wonder if I can get that. And they start doing some really crazy, weird things. And so I think that's why people want power. Because power, then once you got all the wealth that you need, you got all the attention that you need. What you really want is power, the power to control people.
But it
And
sounds
then
like you're saying that, hey, they want the money first and then the power. Whereas I'm saying I think they want the power all along. I mean, of course, I'm not saying that you can't want two things, and so maybe you go after both. But I'm saying I think the focus is initially on the power, and they may see money as a means to get the power. But I'm thinking the power is the first influence, not the second.
trust me, as an employer, power without money is useless.
Well, that's what I say. You may think that money is the means to get the power, but I'm just saying, but your end goal is the power, not necessarily the money.
It may be, but a lot of people who have the power eventually find out and learn quickly that power. It depends on what kind of power you want. I mean,
So he said,
there are a lot of pastors of small churches that they stay in that situation as because they're leaders. They want to be a leader, but they lead about 7 or 8 people in that congregation, and they don't they don't give that up because not because they've got a conviction. If you were to be honest about it, not because they've got a conviction by God to say, "Hey, this is what I called you to pastor these 7 or 8 people." You got more family members than that, and they don't even come to your church. And so there's people stay in that position sometimes not because of a conviction of God, but because they really enjoy having that position of power, and they're willing to compromise financial stability, and they struggle and struggle because of it. Um, I actually look at my practice and I wonder sometimes, are you holding on to this practice because, it's a pride thing for you and you enjoy saying, hey, I'm an entrepreneur? And is that emblematic of a quest for power? And I don't think that it is necessarily. So I'll let that sucker go once the money comes. Show me the money. You can have I'm at the show me the money stage in my life right now.
I was gonna say because when you started your practice, I imagine there was a little bit of, hey, I have but you of course correct me if I'm wrong, so I wasn't there, but I have the ability to be able to use my education, my resources, even your money to manage all this yourself versus to work for someone else. And there is to some degree of power even in that mentality. And for a lot of entrepreneurs, I'd imagine some of that is, hey, I'd rather whatever my efforts do go to me than to someone else. And so there's this, hey, if they can do it, why can't I do it? So then let me do it. And that to me means it's not necessarily about the money per se. It's about, hey, let me show that my ability and how even my ability is able to achieve whatever someone else achieved. Why work for someone else when I can do it myself? Um,
Yeah, I don't know. I think when you're a natural leader, you don't ever seek power. Power seeks you. And that's a perspective that I have because even when I opened my practice, I never really intended to ever be an entrepreneur. It was the only opportunity that I had to be in Nashville. I knew I wanted to be in Nashville, and so it was going to be either you can go join this other practice, or you can be employed by the hospital, or we can set you up as your own in your own practice. And those choices were not given to me; they were given to the doctor who was already there. Yeah, how would you like us to bring him in? Because we're going to bring in another doctor, and that choice was made for me. So the other doctor said, "Yeah, well, bring him in as a solo practitioner." And so that's the way that it was thrust on me. So it was never anything that I actually said, "Hey, I want to go out and start my own business and be that way." It wasn't that I sought the power; it was that the power pretty much sought me. And I think even if or when I sell my practice, um, you still just be a natural leader, whether you try to acquire that power or not. Now, people who actually try to acquire, who intentional about acquiring that power, in my opinion, are not natural leaders. You might as well go after the money because the power is not going to be influence. And so, if it was the purpose of having power, if you don't have influence over people.
Well, we can debate this all day long whether you're a natural leader, but I will say that I will say that for the most part, everyone is influencing somebody. And so, I mean, when I teach disciple making, I make it very clear people are watching you, whether you intentionally want them to do it or not. We can always remember Charles Barkley infamously saying, "Hey, I'm no role model," and we had to remind him, "Yes, you are." Whether that is a title you want to make or not, the reality is people, particularly young kids who want to play basketball, see you and want to know how have done it and want to follow in your same path. But I will also say, as Christians, we have to understand that God has built us to worship. And so I think for a lot of times, if you're not worshiping Him, you probably are worshiping money, or you probably are worshiping fame. And to your point, whether you hit a certain threshold or not, you will not be satisfied, because then you're looking for the next worship. Like, what is it then? Since this didn't give me the quote unquote happiness or contentment that I thought would give me some peace, let's find the next thing to figure out what that will be to give you whatever peace or happiness that you feel like you deservedly have earned. And so, I mean, I just said it to say, I mean, we're all leading somebody, and we do need to all recognize that. Now, just because you're not the president of the United States doesn't mean that you're not influential in some area. I do think to some degree, if we're limiting natural to mean people, to mean that you don't necessarily want the leadership, but people are following you anyways. Yeah, I would definitely not put Donald Trump in that. He was very intentional about wanting to have a following. And we've talked about this before. We sometimes don't even know if he believes this or not, because it's so important for him to have the following that whether he believes it becomes irrelevant. But then there are people who are, how if you're defining natural leaders as people who, yes, I see the light in you so brightly that I want to gravitate to you to figure out what that is, then that becomes their natural leadership. But even in that, I mean, again, you got to be careful, because you still are likely making mistakes that you don't necessarily want other people to follow, but they're nonetheless following even your mistakes. And so, even as you are naturally leading, you could still be naturally leading them to destruction.
Yeah, I would. The one thing that I would probably disagree with you on that is just because somebody's watching you doesn't mean that they're following you. Yes, people are always watching you, always observing what your behaviors are. And sometimes they watch that and are repulsed by it, let alone, and certainly aren't following you because of it. And so uh, we must always be mindful that, yeah, people are always watching. We're always giving a witness one way or the other, especially as those who are members of the body of Christ. And so the leader is the one who actually says, I'm not that says, but the one who, when people see them and their conduct of business or just general conduct, period, they see them, that's somebody I can emulate. That's somebody I can help support. That's somebody I can learn from. And and so then I have to try to exert power around that because every situation you get in, people recognize you as a leader. It's funny because every time it doesn't matter what situation I had a patient came in yesterday. Her Uber driver dropped her off at the office. She said, "Oh, you see Dr. Mark Williams? Oh, he is such a great guy. He's such a great doctor and such." And that's what she told the passenger who happened to be my patient at that time. And she said, "I think he's a pastor too." And I'm sitting there thinking, like, why do people think that I'm a pastor? I am not a pastor. Everywhere I've gone in Cincinnati, I attend the church. People call me Pastor Mark. You know I'm not a pastor here. Why do you still call me Pastor Mark? And it's because people see that in you. You don't have to have that type of title. Actually, when I went to that church in Cincinnati in particular, God said, "Don't seek or accept a position of leadership." And I'm saying, if you didn't want me to seek or accept a position of leadership, why do you then establish me as a leader? Right? Because you don't have to have the position. You don't have to have the title to be the leader, is what God was showing. He said, "And the last day I pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and daughters will prophesy." You didn't have to necessarily be an appointed prophet to prophesy. All you have to do is be a son and a daughter to be influential. And so I think those persons who actually seek power um, may do it because they seek money, but they also may do it because they seek influence as well. And after you obtain either one of them, then the natural inclination is to say, if it wasn't that which God created you to do, and you don't have a relationship with God, and you don't find your joy and satisfaction and completeness in Him, then you'll always be searching for something more. And whether that more is going to be more fame, more power, more lust, more adventures, more experiences, whatever those things are, you're always going to be seeking more. And for me, the only more I want is more of God. I'm so holy, so holy. I say that in uh my most humble position and posture. I say that.
Couldn't even get it out with a straight face.
There's nobody more humble than me.
Well, hopefully the viewers are weighing in because I mean, again, I feel like money is so tangible that it is something that, again, the value is placed on what you can do with it and not necessarily on it itself. And I feel like, again, people are chasing what they think money can do for you, and whether that is power, fame, influence, then I think that they are really saying, "Hey, I just want to amass a certain amount of money." And so, with that, and then Jeff Bezos, you brought him up. I think he's another example. I mean, you have Washington Post, you have Amazon, yet you did not let that article come out simply because you were afraid of what it would do to the influence that you have. I mean, money was not even, to me, it would have probably given you even more money had you let that article come out, considering that so many people dropped their subscriptions after you've done that. And again, I'm sure for years they've been doing this opinion column, when it came to presidential elections, but you chose this one because I think again you were fearful of the influence that you would no longer have in the political environment. And so I don't know. I
I,
just think that
I,
that is probably a little bit more powerful than the money itself.
well, here's the scripture tells us that wisdom and money are both a defense. And so there's a defense or shade. I think is one other scripture that the one other version of the scripture call it. Money is a shade. It offers protection, and what we're finding out even right now is that money is going to offer protection for those persons who are, well, every American is about to deal with an economic hardship. I mean, under these policies, unless, of course, Donald Trump changes course, we're all going to have to deal with that hardship. But some people are going to be less influenced by it. Some people will resort to violence and stealing from other people. Some people's marriages will fall apart. Some people's lives will be turned upside down. Some people's children will die because they don't have the funding for it. But then there are those people who have the money who will remain unassuaged by the pending economic hardship because money actually can be a defense. It can be a shade for you, as we find with Donald Trump. $100 million of free legal defense is actually going to be a huge defense for him.
That he wasn't paid for anyways, but but I guess he could say, "Hey, American people, I at least saved you over hundreds of $1,000s in legal fees."
Right. And what do I need it for now? Because nobody's going to sue me anyway. They're all afraid to sue me.
Oh yeah, he's gonna need it to fight all the states and individuals that are gonna sue him because he's deporting people without due process, as well as all the other things that he's doing and it's hurtful.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we'll see what happens next. Yeah.
All right, because every week there's so much to discuss, and I think we only scratch it, but we we try to make sure not to ignore the bigger things. But again, viewers, if we've missed anything, or if there is a topic or a law or a court that you want us to delve into, by all means, do let us know in the comments, and we will do so. So in the meantime, hopefully you are catching us on your favorite podcast platform, as well as repeats of our episode on Star Radio and K-Day Live. And also make sure you are following us on YouTube. So until next Saturday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Central Standard Time, have a blessed week, and thank you for tuning in.